Welcome, everyone. I hope you're comfortably seated. Just before I hand over to the Vice-Chancellor to formally welcome you, I've got a couple of polite reminders. So please, could you remember to switch your phones off or to silent? Lots of scrabbling for phones. And also, we're not anticipating a fire alarm tonight, so if there is an alarm, it's not a drill, or it's not anticipating a fire drill, I should have said, so if there is an alarm, it's not a drill. So please make your way outside to the assembly point on the green in front of this building. So you're all very welcome. I'm going to hand over to the Vice-Chancellor to formally welcome you this evening.
Thank you very much, Anita. Great to see a packed house tonight. Inaugurals are wonderful things, and we haven't been able to do them in this way for all sorts of reasons for quite a while. It's a lovely opportunity to mark the highest professional distinction that a university can give to its academics, and it's a delight to be able to do that. The other bit of the delight is that it's an opportunity for our inaugural lecturers to share their expertise in a way that they don't normally share it with family members, with mums, with friends in the audience who are not part of the usual way in which we communicate what we do as academics. And I think that conveying of academic expertise in terms which are accessible to all is a lovely reflection of our academic work. And inaugurals are also a lovely opportunity to showcase how good our academic departments are. And this one clearly belongs in that category of being really very good, as we saw in the ref results a few months ago. Fifth, I think, Paul, in the UK, and with that, the fourth highest in this university, and that's a really outstanding performance, which reflects the work that our brilliant professors do, but all of the colleagues across the department, including our professional service colleagues who help our academics to achieve what they achieve. So in a sense, it's also a departmental celebration. So great to see so many people from the department here. So we're going to hear two great lectures on subjects I'm sure most of us don't know that much about. Genomics and education, second languages, and how students operate in languages which are not their own. And I'm really looking forward to it. And I'll hand over to Paul to introduce our first inaugural lecturer of this evening.
Thank you very much, Charlie. Colleagues, students, guests, happy World Teachers' Day. My name is Paul Wakeling, and I have the honour to be the Head of Department of Education. And tonight we are celebrating two of our newest professors and dear colleagues, Professor Kathryn Asbury and Professor Danijela Trenkic. Later, Professor Monica Schmidt of the Department of Language and Linguistic Science will introduce Professor Trenkic's inaugural lecture. And the pleasure of introducing Professor Kathryn Asbury's inaugural lecture falls to me. So in making that introduction, I've got two main tasks. The first is to inform you or to remind you of how accomplished and wonderful Professor Asbury, Kathryn, is as a scholar and a colleague, and to underline just how much she merits the status of professor. The second task is to complete that first task as quickly as possible and get out of the way for Kathryn to speak to you. Kathryn's academic background shows her to be a Renaissance woman with a valid claim to be a humanist, as well as a natural and a social scientist. Her first degree was in history from the University of Cambridge, followed sometime later by a postgraduate diploma in psychology from Royal Holloway, University of London, and then a PhD in behavioural genetics from King's College London, where she worked with Professor Robert Plomin's group. That PhD, completed in 2005, was a study of the influence of birth weight and family environment on early childhood behaviour, taking genetics into account. Kathryn first came to York as a lecturer in 2012, 10 years ago, last month, following a British Academy postdoctoral fellowship and as one of a small group of educational psychologists tasked with setting up a new degree. And I'll say more about that in a moment. The questions Kathryn addresses in her research have their roots in the fundamental questions of philosophy and the social sciences. Are human lives governed by nature or by nurture? Is it our genetic composition or our environment and personal agency which shapes our fate? These big questions take shape in Kathryn's work in understanding children's lives and their educational outcomes. Her overriding concern has been how we should shape the interventions we make through education to take account of what influences learning, our individual genetic endowments and our environment. This has included a series of studies drawing on the large TEDS dataset of monozygotic, or in English, identical twins, who share genes and some of their environment too, to look at the heritability of educational outcomes. Kathryn has always striven to consider the implications of her research findings for educational policy and classroom practice, highlighted most prominently perhaps by her 2013 book with Robert Plomin, G is for Genes. Psychologists using polygenomic genome-wide association studies and sociologists like me often take quite different positions on questions of nature and nurture and what they mean for educational policy and practice. At the more excitable end of each discipline, this can sometimes mean talking past each other rather than to each other. While Kathryn's scholarship can be provocative, one of her strongest qualities as a scholar is listening. Her work is always an open dialogue with evidence, with other perspectives and approaches, and also, as in some of her latest work, with the people it most concerns. Professors are supposed to, well, profess, but they do that best, especially in the field of education, when, like Kathryn, they listen carefully too. Kathryn has exemplified this dialogic approach in discussing her research publicly, such as on Radio 4's Moral Maze, regular invited talks, newspaper features, and smaller scale discussions, whether that's talking to civil servants at the DFE or doing psychology in the pub. More recently, Kathryn's research has taken a qualitative turn, and she has focused her attention on the impacts of COVID-19. Working with our colleagues Lisa Kim, Uma Tasib and others, her articles on the impact of lockdown on, respectively, teachers and on families with children with special educational needs highlight the challenge they faced. And those have already attracted hundreds of citations since their recent publication. Alongside her research, Kathryn has made an outstanding contribution to the Department of Education at the University of York in a number of roles. Arriving in 2012, she was one of the small group of educational psychologists who came to be affectionately known as the Three Musketeers. Together with an even smaller group of existing colleagues, they put together our BSc in Psychology and Education, gained accreditation from the British Psychological Society, and launched it to great success. Today, it's the largest degree programme in the department. But not content with that success, Kathryn then became the inaugural programme leader for our MSc in Psychology and Education, and after a short spell as interim deputy head of department, latterly she's been our highly successful director of research, leading the department to its best ever outcome in the most recent Research Excellence Framework, as the Vice-Chancellor explained. Through everything she does, Kathryn exemplifies the best qualities of academic leadership. She cares deeply about her work and the people she works with. I speak on behalf of the entire department in underlining our delight in her richly deserved promotion to Professor, and I hope you join me in acknowledging that through the traditional medium of applause. Professor Asbury, over to you.
Hello, and thank you for being here. Thank you so much to Paul for those kind words, and to Vanita and the Vice-Chancellor for hosting this occasion. This evening, I want to talk to you about whether progress in genomic science presents us with a golden opportunity to better understand why individuals differ from each other and to get better at meeting individuals' needs, so a kind of personalised panacea, or whether it's something we need to fear and guard against, a tool for elitism and exclusion, something that could be used to marginalise or even eradicate certain ways of being. About 18 months ago, I was working on a project with the Early Intervention Foundation in London. In it, we gathered 4 groups of experts, including senior policymakers, public sector leaders, leaders from the charity sector, and academics, to discuss this question. Can DNA data be used to improve outcomes for children and families without marginalising individuals, entrenching disadvantage, or increasing inequalities? In other words, can we harness the findings from genomic research to do some good in the world for some of the people who might need that the most? So, why does this question matter? And why does it matter now in particular? Well, the fact is that genomic science is progressing really, really quickly. 10 years ago, we knew that a combination of genes and experiences explain why we differ from each other in personality and intelligence and general healthiness and height and weight and pretty much anything you might care to measure, and psychologists do like to measure things. I mean, even things like your propensity to enjoy the Godfather films or the Harry Potter films or the firmness of your handshake, whatever you want to measure. And we knew this beyond any reasonable doubt. And we knew that because genes and that genes and the environment both influence individual differences in human behaviour is no longer controversial, thanks to decades of twin and family studies that have made that abundantly clear and very difficult to argue with. However, until recently, researchers had been unable to identify any of the specific genetic variants involved in that process. In more recent years, we've seen the advent of genome-wide association studies, known as GWAS. And I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that these studies are revolutionising research into the genetics of human behaviour. GWAS work by screening the whole genome to find genetic variants that seem to be linked with a particular trait or diagnosis or aspect of behaviour. And by drawing on DNA from millions of people, they've been able to identify specific genes that are associated with aspects of behaviour that range from reading ability to schizophrenia to conscientiousness, and to combine them in polygenic scores. So what, you might very reasonably ask, is a polygenic score? Well, very briefly, and almost certainly too briefly, a polygenic score is a statistic that clusters the effect of all the genetic variants that are associated with a particular aspect of behaviour or a trait or a diagnosis, and works as a numerical index of risk or probability of scoring low or high on that particular trait. Clear as mud? Stay with me. Thinking about education specifically, we now have a polygenic score known as EA4 that tells us as much about why we differ from each other in our educational outcomes as family income does. And that feels like important knowledge. We certainly use family income data in making planning and resourcing decisions in education around eligibility for free school meals or the pupil premium. But I don't think we're very well prepared to be making equivalent decisions about whether we want to use DNA data in this same way. There's an awful lot of thinking, planning, and consulting still to be done. And that's great for me because it keeps me in a very interesting line of work. But really, it's a bad thing. And it's bad because the scientific progress is really, really rapid, and social policy thinking around it is simply not keeping up. So anyway, that was the starting point for these workshops that I ran with the Early Intervention Foundation. And in them, we presented diverse groups of experts with an overview of some relevant findings from genetic research, and then we asked them what they thought the risks and benefits of using tools like this in education and social policy might be. During the discussion, they agreed on a few things, which is not always a given in these scenarios. One of these was that neither the public nor policymakers properly understand genetic research. It's complex and it's bogged down in a challenging and genuinely very troubling historical and political context. And as a result, there are lots of misconceptions and a very high level of distrust surrounding genetics. So it seems clear that while we need to be mindful of people's very reasonable fears, we also need to address these misconceptions through really good education and engagement before we can even consider moving forward. I would argue that this should start in school science lessons and maybe citizenship too. That's when long-term change can really be established, but that a broader programme of public engagement is also needed to address the problem in the short term. We also presented our experts with 2 scenarios for discussion. In the first, we asked them to discuss whether we should consider allocating extra resources to schools and pupils on the basis of scoring low on a polygenic score for educational attainment. In other words, should we consider the risk of genetic disadvantage, in itself a pretty controversial concept, I guess, in the same way as we consider the risk of income disadvantage? Now, on the whole, the experts felt that this was not a great idea because it has potential to cause more problems than it solves. It could increase stigma and exclusion without necessarily offering any very clear and tangible benefits. And on the whole, I think I'm inclined to agree with the experts on this. I also think the idea of genetic disadvantage merits further considerations by philosophers and policy experts, as well as psychologists and geneticists, and that's something I'm interested in working on in the coming years. In the second scenario, which is the one I really want to focus on this evening, we asked them to discuss whether polygenic scores, if they become powerful enough, which they certainly could as GWAS get bigger, should be used to screen newborn babies for their likelihood of experiencing special educational needs or disabilities, including being diagnosed with a condition such as ADHD, autism, or dyslexia. The baby in this photo has just had a heel prick test, which lots of you will know is the test that all babies have on their 5th day of life to screen for things like cystic fibrosis and sickle cell disease and PKU. The experts were generally much more positive about this than they had been about a more general approach to genetic disadvantage in education. They could see benefits such as opportunities for early identification and early intervention, so hints of a personalised panacea, I guess. But they also expressed very significant concerns around stigma and self-fulfilling prophecies, among other issues. And again, I agree with it. There's an awful lot of agreement for academics going on here. But again, I do agree with the experts' view here. I think this merits looking into more closely, something I want to do myself in the coming years with colleagues at York, such as Tasib, and colleagues in other universities. But at the same time, we have to be extremely careful to protect the rights and needs of the children and young people who would be most affected. This ref or no ref is not an area where we should be rushing to impact. At around the same time as this project was underway, Dr. Diana Fields was asking some very similar questions in a very different way to groups of 4, 7 and 10-year-old children in 2 Sheffield primary schools as part of her PhD. So Dee introduced these children to 2 puppets, Zig, who has learning difficulties, and Zag, who has behaviour problems. And as you can see, Zig and Zag look exactly the same, apart from their name labels. And the children knew what they each struggled with because of the stories that Dee told them. So she read them comics and stories which showed how Zig struggled with reading and writing and understanding, and how Zag struggled with sitting nicely on the carpet and not shoving the other kids in the line, or the other puppets in the line, I should say. So they understood a little bit about how each of them behaved and what was challenging for them. Once the children had got to know Zig and Zag, and it was very cute how they did, they cuddled them and they talked to them and they told them about their day. So they built up a little bit of a relationship with these nice puppets. Dee asked them to imagine Zig or Zag meeting another puppet when they grew up, Zog, and going on to have a baby puppet, Zeggy. She asked them what they would think about getting baby Zeggy a test, which she was very clear wouldn't hurt a bit, to find out how likely they would be to grow up with learning difficulties if Zig was their parent, or behaviour problems if Zag was. And in this way, she was asking these very young children what they thought could be the risks and benefits of DNA screening for special educational needs and disabilities. So pretty much exactly what we were asking our esteemed experts. And what I love most about this lovely study is that these young children, even the youngest of them, the 4-year-olds, came up with almost exactly the same hopes, questions, answers, and concerns as the experts. And they did it in very cute little Sheffield accents with brilliant spelling mistakes. It was more entertaining. Sorry, experts. What I love less is how negative these children were about what life is like for children with special educational needs and disabilities in UK schools. But that's a topic for another talk and probably another project. So we were left with very mixed views from our senior civil servants and academics and from our lovely children, which is probably as it should be. And we were wondering where to go next with this interesting, I think, and I hope you agree, I hope you're not sat there thinking, oh my God, I could have been at home now watching telly, but very thorny question. And then just over a year ago, in August 2021, something quite significant happened. The Wellcome Trust funded a large study, Spectrum 10K, that was designed to collect DNA from 10,000 autistic individuals with a view to better understanding the genetic and environmental links between autism and a range of physical and mental conditions that are more prevalent in the autistic community. It was led by researchers at Cambridge and UCLA in the States who, to put it politely, have quite a difficult relationship with large sections of the autistic community. And I mention this only because I think it was one of many important of the many important factors in what happened next. Another was a lack of deep and genuine consultation with autistic people prior to designing and launching the study, and some missteps in terms of how the study was communicated. So less than 3 weeks after its launch, this £3 million study, Spectrum 10K, was paused indefinitely due to a substantial and sustained backlash from the autistic community, including accusations of eugenics. This image shows activists protesting outside the principal investigator's labs in Cambridge. And it quickly became clear that some members of the autistic community saw Spectrum 10K as a backdoor to prenatal screening for autism. And not surprisingly, they were distressed and furious at what they saw as a genuinely existential threat. Now, I found this situation fascinating. On the face of it, Spectrum 10K seemed to me to be a perfectly reasonable project with reasonable potential to do some good for autistic people. So to witness the distress and anger caused by its launch gave me serious pause for thought and told me several things. First, this kind of research is just not viable without proper engagement with the people it most affects. So in this case, autistic people. When studying the genomics of autism, autistic people have to be included in discussions from the outset, and they have to have an active role in designing the research, not just rubber stamping it. Ideally, there should be autistic researchers involved in the project throughout its life, and a panel of experts by experience to consult with as the project unfolds. And the same principles must apply for studies of learning disabilities, behaviour problems, and psychiatric disorders, among other conditions. To be honest, research should have been happening like this for a long time. And in 2022, I would say there is no excuse for it not being the norm. The second lesson I drew, although this one wasn't at all new to me, and I've already mentioned it, in fact, was that there were misconceptions everywhere about geneticists and genetic research. And a major programme of education is needed to address them if it's to be possible to make decisions as a society about whether and how we want to use DNA data in public life. And this seems to me to be a really urgent priority. Finally, I saw very clearly that community activism is powerful. The Spectrum 10K team are currently undertaking an expensive public consultation, and who knows if the project will eventually be reactivated. I think it probably will, but probably in a more restricted or limited way, and over a year has already been lost. Stakeholders, quite rightly, sometimes have the power to shut research down if they fear it could harm them. Although I think it's also worth reflecting on whether some groups are less powerful in this way than others. However, I also had the uncomfortable feeling that the voices we were hearing in this activism were potentially those of a relatively narrow range of the autistic population. And I wondered how representative of the autistic community and the broader autism community they really were. Those of you who use Twitter will be very familiar with the power of the loudest voices. So these musings gave rise to the PEAPOD study, a qualitative study of personal experiences of autism and perceptions of DNA-based research. The D is working really hard in that acronym, but the Mendel links, it was too hard to resist. So yes, PEAPOD. And I started the study with colleagues and collaborators here at York earlier this year, including 2 fabulous experts by experience. So to date, the PEAPOD team has spoken to 3 groups of people about their perceptions of genetic research. Autistic adults who were diagnosed in adulthood, parents of autistic children who are thriving in mainstream school, and parents of non-verbal autistic children, and it's that latter group that I want to focus on now. Our autistic adults study was led by Becky Ellis, and our mainstream school study was led by Annalisa Lanza. So we collected data from 20 parents of autistic children of primary school age who are non-verbal or minimally verbal. We asked them what they thought about genetic research and whether they would be happy for their child to take part in a genetic study of autism. What we found was that most participants were enthusiastic about autism research in general, and a surprising proportion were enthusiastic about genetic studies of autism specifically. Most of our participants were generally open to their children taking part in a genetic autism study as long, and this was pretty much the first thing that every one of them said, as long as they didn't have to have a blood test. I think bitter experience had taught these families that taking blood is traumatic for their children and therefore for them as well. Making it clear that DNA can be collected without a blood test seems to be one very simple action for scientists to take when explaining what participation will involve. And this probably needs to be front and centre in the recruitment materials rather than buried away in the ethics documents, because it does appear to represent a genuinely material barrier to participation. However, for most participants, this general support for both basic and applied research came with the loud and clear message that they were absolutely not up for it if the research was designed to lead to either the eradication of autism or its cure. The vast majority of these parents loved their kids as they were. They just wanted life to be made a little bit easier for them. So here we can see one mum saying, yes, it all comes down to what the intended outcome is really, and how they see that would benefit the autistic community rather than benefit the non-autistic rest of the world that might just see it as a problem. Parents were primarily interested in research that would help them to better understand and support their children, such as research focused on sensory needs or speech, language and communication problems. And here again, we've got a participant saying, that's what I'd love to be able to do with my son, understand how his brain works and understand how you can help it from a genetic perspective. So I think these voices are giving researchers some idea of what this group wants from the research that we conduct and what we have a responsibility to do. They were open to genetic studies of these needs, but clear that the focus had to be on enhancing understanding with a view to improving support. Some, but certainly not all participants, liked the idea of developing polygenic scores to assess autism risk from birth, and they said that they felt this could have made life better and easier for both their children and themselves. And as one participant put it, so it wouldn't have changed her outcome, but it may have made us less stressed and more patient. And that in itself can only have had a positive impact on her, can't it? They talked about knowledge as power, arguing that if they had known their child might be autistic from birth, they would have taken the time to educate themselves and prepare for a future that was different from the one that they may have imagined. Some felt it might have reduced their guilt and anxiety and improved their parenting by making them feel free to tailor their responses to the child in front of them rather than to advice from parenting manuals or societal norms. Examples included not insisting on their child wearing particular clothes and fabrics that obviously caused them distress, or foods that they rejected and were also causing them distress. One parent talked about how it could have taken pressure off her as a mother. We wouldn't have had to go through 3 or 4 years of what's happening. Is there something really wrong with him? Did I do something that wasn't right? Did I eat something that wasn't right? We wouldn't have had to have gone through that. There was also a belief that a polygenic risk indicator would trigger early support that could have benefited their children. I think it will make that support start straight away. I think as soon as you start talking about genetics, people believe you. I don't know why. And I think it's because it's on paper. It's black and white, where if you just like the non-verbal, I don't know. I just think there are so many things that it holds a higher weight with, including professionals, including medical and educational professionals. They just believe you, rather than it being, it could be, it could be, it could be. The support will start straight away. So this is an example where we see parents seeing genetic information as a particularly powerful type of information, carrying a weight that their child's behaviour and their own observations did not, which I think is sad. However, it's also important to note that others felt that polygenic scores were at best pointless because we don't currently have good enough interventions with which to respond. So as one participant put it here, it's possible that some early intervention might in the future allow autistic children to live less challenging lives, but nothing like that is available at present to my knowledge. I think that's largely true. In other words, such a test would not be clinically actionable, and it's important to note that it's highly unlikely that such a test would be authorised in the UK unless it was clinically actionable. It's also interesting to note that Dee's little children in Sheffield picked up on exactly the same point. They recognised that clinical actionability argument even from the age of 4. There was also a lack of trust in society and political leaders to want to improve support for disabled and neurodivergent children, even if highly effective interventions should become available. And one can only imagine that this lack of trust is higher right now than ever in our current political climate. Some made the point that they had enjoyed the year or two before their child's struggles became apparent, and that worrying about risk might have taken this away from them. and interfered with parent-child bonding to the detriment of both. So here we can see a parent saying, I can't see how it would have made any difference other than that we might have not enjoyed so completely the early months of our child's life. It seems like a valid concern. So, to address the question I set at the beginning of this talk, can DNA data be used to improve outcomes for children and families without marginalising individuals, entrenching disadvantage and increasing inequalities? Well, I have to put my hands up and say I still don't know. I don't think anybody does. I think we need really good interdisciplinary social science research and well-designed and effective science education and science communication to get us to a stage where we can answer that question with any confidence. And I think that if we do, at some point in the future, try to apply DNA data in this way, that special educational needs and disabilities might be the best and most constructive place to start. But I think it's a question that the whole of society needs to grapple with, and the voices of those who could be most affected should be listened to most carefully, whether they are individuals with special educational needs or individuals from other minority groups. I don't believe genomic science offers us a personalised panacea or represents an existential threat. The truth, as always, boringly, lies somewhere in the middle. Before I finish, I want to thank a very long list of people, my fabulous current and former PhD students, my own PhD supervisor and postdoctoral mentor, Professor Robert Plomin, my wonderful colleagues and friends in the Department of Education, my husband, Jonah, and my children, George, Herbie, Iris, Connie, and Martha, my family, especially those of you who are here with us this evening, and in particular my sister Helen and my mum, who provided both the nature and the nurture that has made so much of my life and career possible. Thanks, Mum. And thank you all very much for listening.
I think we had a fantastic insight into a sensitive issue which showed how well-meaning research, the Wellcome study, can run into the buffers if you don't think hard enough about the subject group you're researching on. It's about research with rather than research on.
Yeah, absolutely.
A cautionary tale for many of us. We have a few minutes, 5 or so minutes, to get a few reflections from our audience, not just our education academics, but we have a much wider audience tonight. So who would like to make a comment or ask a question? We have a couple of people around with microphones, I believe.
We've got Nancy and Iris, who very kindly agreed to be roving mic. So if you could just please wait till they get the microphone to you before you start talking, that would be great.
Middle row on middle of the left-hand side. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that fascinating talk. And I was especially inspired by your comparison of the experts and the 4-year-olds.
It's humbling.
Could you speak a bit more about what the 4-year-olds came up with and how that did compare to what the experts said?
Yeah, so they did say very similar things. They raised that clinical actionability point, they raised the what's the point question, but they also raised the, maybe it gives you a heads up and teachers can get the fidget toys out in class or get the sort of special resources in place. But there was also quite a lot of talk about, well, do you really need to know? Does it matter? Because their mum and dads are going to love them anyway, and the children will be kind to them. But what they said about how they would be and how they would feel then didn't match up to how awful they seemed to think it was to have these particular needs. So there was a bit of a disconnect there. But yeah.
I'll just think about it. We'll come to you in a second. Just a quick addendum to that. What do you think the other approach to research could learn from the kids?
Oh, wow. Well, I think all of this research could learn a lot from kids. I think we don't hear the voices of children. We assume that things are too complicated for them to access and understand. And I think what we saw in this study is that that's not the case. And if we just use creative, innovative methods that are on the level of the child, then children can have a voice and a say in probably most aspects of public life. And so I think maybe what research can learn is that we should be doing more to develop those creative methods to amplify children's voices, because they're key stakeholders in pretty much everything that everybody's deciding anywhere.
Well, it's lovely to see that those complicated technical and ethical questions were being negotiated just as well by 4-year-olds.
Yeah, absolutely. Who needs a PhD?
Please.
Thank you. That was a fabulous talk, very thought-provoking. This is a slightly tangential question, but if one weren't to use the genomic polygenic scores for prediction of outcome as such, but instead a tool to try and capture gene-environment interplay, it's a very broad speculative question, but how do you think that, what might some initial steps in that process look like?
That's a great question. And I think it probably is the way that this research, if it proceeds in the way that some people want it to proceed, should head, because then you start to get at the nuance and you start to see if children have this particular genetic makeup and they live in these particular circumstances, what does that mean? It's likely to play out differently to the same genetic material in different environmental circumstances. So I think it would be a more sensitive and more nuanced way of doing things. And it might also give you a really good opportunity to identify families who would appreciate the help earlier on without, and maybe to some extent negate that risk of all of the anxiety without any of the certainty. So just, it might help us to identify where early intervention might be really valuable.
Who's next? Please, here in the front row.
What can you do to make sure that the louder voices are managed and that the less heard are heard?
So I think the important thing is to make sure the less heard are heard. The louder voices are doing a great job. They're standing up for what they believe. They're saying what they think should happen. And I don't think we should try to change that. The problem is that sometimes you get, this is what the autistic community thinks, and I think that's not always the case. And you could put any word in any particular community. So I think it's finding ways to talk to those people who otherwise can't be heard, so that their voices are heard alongside. So one of the reasons we chose to talk to parents of non-verbal autistic children was getting a little bit closer to those groups. What we'd really like to do is talk to the non-verbal autistic children themselves and not to their parents. And that's maybe where there's a challenge for us to develop creative methods of including voices for people who don't have voices in the traditional sense. I think that's a really big challenge for the psychology community at the moment.
Over there, please.
I hope you'll excuse a question from a social scientist who is very ignorant around the genomics and genetic side of things. But from my popular science reading, my understanding has been that the nature versus nurture debate has become a lot more blurred, and a lot of the kind of nature stuff, and I assume this might mean genetics, is shaped by the environment. And so is it still fair to talk about nature versus nurture? And I apologise for asking that as a big question right at the end.
No, it's a great question. And I think, no, it's not. And I think certainly within the psychology community, people don't anymore. I think around the time I started my PhD, it was already clear that we should be talking about nature via nurture rather than nature versus nurture. But again, the kind of public education programme that I've mentioned needs to address that as well, because there's still this very strong idea out there that nature and nurture are in opposition to each other. And neither can function without the other. They are completely interdependent. So I think nature via nurture is a much better way of characterizing it.
One more reflection from me. I'm fascinated by the research project that ran into, I think, quite rightly ran into resistance. The Wellcome Trust is a brilliant funder, and it's very rigorous, and there would have been all sorts of academics involved in the peer review of those ideas, as well as the academics who came up with the idea in the first place. How did so many people get it wrong?
I think it was just overlooking the importance of participatory research methods, which is something that's getting bigger and bigger in the research landscape, but maybe at the time this was developed and the funding proposal went in, wasn't seen as important, as being as important as it is. And so there were nods to it. There were kind of autistic ambassadors for the project. There were a couple of people on an advisory board. But I think what critics would say, and I think it's largely fair, is that those attempts were tokenistic and it wasn't very genuine and meaningful. And so this is a big wake-up call to the whole research community that no, you don't just look like you're doing it, you need to do it right.
Okay, perhaps time for one more. No, in that case, I think you are released from your
Thank you very much. Thanks, everyone.
Do I need to bring up your PowerPoint, Danijela, or your... You want to do it? Yeah. Do you want my PowerPoint? Yeah. I just thought it might be nice to have your title up there. Yes. Thank you. Thank you very much. It is a really great honor and an even greater pleasure to introduce my very dear colleague, Danijela Trenkic. I would particularly like to extend a warm welcome to some of her family members who are here today. In particular, of course, her husband, Joe, her brother, Vlad, and his wife, Snow, as well as Joe's sister, Jane, with her husband, Jim, and their daughter, Phoebe. Welcome to this really, really interesting afternoon. Unfortunately, Danijela's mother, Mira Trenkic, was unable to come, but she is watching this via the live stream, so I would like to welcome her particularly. Okay, this next bit was the bit that I was very nervous about. Draga gospođo Trenkic, žao što danas ne možete da budete ovdje za nama. Želimo da znate da je vaša ćerka divna koleginica i visoko cenjena naučnica na međunarodnom nivou. Sigurno ste veoma ponosni na nju i to sa punim pravom. I don't know any Serbian whatsoever, so I hope that what I just said, if I accidentally said something very offensive, please give my apologies afterwards. But I hope what I just said is that, first of all, we're all really, really sorry that Ms. Trenkic cannot be here today, but that we'd like her to know what a wonderful colleague Danijela is and how well respected she is in the international community. Danijela is, as far as I know, the only person that I know who has met the late Queen. She told me something about this encounter, which I haven't yet had opportunity to use, but I want to share because there are a lot of people here who might potentially in the future benefit from this. And it is that if you meet a monarch, if you are a man, you bow. If you are a woman, you curtsy. But if you're a woman who has a PhD and you don't have the necessary core strength and coordination and the money to hire a coach to teach you how to do that, if you're a woman who has a PhD, you can bow as well. So I'm just sharing this little bit of information. I guess most of us will never get to that point where we meet the monarch. How did Danijela get to it? Well, she was working at the time at the University of Cambridge. Danijela was not the Queen, but the Queen came to visit. And Danijela was among the group of people who were chosen to present their research. And I think that really tells us a lot about Danijela, because all we know is that if you have a visit like that to an institution, you put forward the best and the brightest. You put forward your absolute stars. And that, at that time, in that group, at the University of Cambridge, was a no-brainer. Of course, it was Danijela. Before she went to Cambridge, where she did her MA and her PhD, she got a BA in Belgrade. And then she had brief tenures at Heriot-Watt University in Edinburgh and at Portsmouth before, I'm sorry, it's not COVID, just got a bit of a throat, before she came to join the University of York. When I prepared this introduction, even though I have known Danijela for a long time, I'm very familiar with her research, but when I looked at the breadth of everything that she had done, I found myself surprised. I thought, I didn't know that she'd done all of these things. So Danijela Danijela's research spans three very distinct areas. The first one is probably the most fundamental in the discipline of linguistics. And we've heard a lot already about nature versus nurture, and of course that is also something that we find in linguistics. We find ourselves faced with the conundrum that all small children are able, or in the absence of developmental disabilities or whatever, all small children are able to acquire highly abstract and highly complex properties of the language that they are exposed to. This goes to the point that children who are less than 6 months old, they're barely able to roll themselves from their back to their front. They're barely able to find their mouth with their hands, but they are able to respond to very fine-grained differences in languages, and they're able to pick up on them, and they're able to use that to learn the language, to the extent that the variability in what people know about their language at the end of the learning stage is minimal. And that really isn't the case for any other abstract skill. So the question is, are people born basically with a blueprint of language in their mind? Are people born knowing at a fundamental level what to expect? If you put 10 linguists in a room and ask them to fight this out, there will be at least 20 very, very different opinions among them. And the conundrum is made worse by the fact that when you look at older learners who learn a second language, there is massive variability. So what does that tell us about this blueprint? So that kind of question, in a nutshell, is one of the first areas that Danijela's research addresses, that she started working on her PhD, when she addressed one of the things that is really the most puzzling is that some of the features that children all learn are very, very and persistently hard for adults, and among those features is the use of articles, particularly by speakers of Slavic languages. So this is a kind of very theoretical and very fundamental piece of work that Danijela's research has contributed to. Then secondly, she looks at other features of cognitive abilities, for example, working memory, those kinds of things, to try and explain why it is that when you look at older learners, you have this massive variability in outcomes that children don't have. If 10 people start learning a foreign language at the same time, at the same level of intensity, some of them will get some of the properties, others won't. You don't see that in children. Why is that? And then finally, Danijela's research makes the bridge between these two very, very different and very complex areas to teaching. What can we learn from what we see in those other kinds of circumstances? What can we learn about becoming better language teachers and about helping, supporting second language learners better? Danijela has published her research in, I'm not going to bore you all with a long list of all the things, all the places she's published. She has published in all the very best journals. She has presented at all of the most important conferences. I've personally really enjoyed working together with her. We've been colleagues and collaborators for a long time in the executive committee of the European Second Language Association, of which she was the president between 2015 and 2019, and her successor in that role is here too. There she is, Claire Wright. Hello, Claire. Welcome too. And I also very much enjoyed one of the best organized Eurosla conferences ever. Sorry, Benedetta, I'm setting the challenge high here for next year. And one of the best organized Eurosla conferences ever, which Danijela helped co-organize in 2014 here at the University of York. I'm really happy and really pleased to be Danijela's colleague, and I'm very much looking forward to her talk today.
Is the mic working? Yeah, good. Okay. Well, thank you, Monica, for this really warm introduction, and thank you everyone who braved the rain and rail strikes and potential COVID infections to be here tonight. It is an immense privilege to stand here this evening and to be able to reflect on what is it that I do and why it matters. I do research on bilingualism, and I think of bilingualism as nothing short of a superpower. Bilingualism will not get you to leap tall buildings in a single bound, but it gives you something even more special, and that's the ability to communicate in two languages. You're not impressed. It doesn't sound like much. But actually think about it. Bilinguals really bind the world together. They're bridges. They're conduits for information flow between cultures and societies. Can you imagine the world without bilinguals? Just how less developed our knowledge, our technologies, our societies would be. I'd say bilingualism makes us collectively smarter. Everyone benefits from bilingualism, whether we ourselves speak another language or not. There are, of course, personal benefits of bilingualism, because bilingualism connects you to more people. It affords you more diverse experiences. It opens up new possibilities. Had I stayed monolingual, I would have never been in a position to seize the opportunity when it came to study abroad. And that experience, the people I met there, the qualifications I've got, fundamentally changed my options in life. But like most people who start learning a new language in school or later, I found it hard. And finding it hard is what sparked up my curiosity as to why it's hard. And that question ultimately shaped the research program that I do today. So as Monica hinted, part of my research looks at fundamental issues of this capacity for learning new languages, at how it interacts with languages that we already know. So how two languages, often very different, coexist in the same person. The second strand takes a broader lens, and here I explore how language and literacy skills affect learning and academic outcomes in higher education. And I particularly focus on communities that don't speak English as their main language. And I hope to tell you a bit about both today. Well, I started my research with fundamental questions. Why and how a language is different and how that influences how we learn new languages. And because these issues are complex, when I was choosing a topic for my PhD, I was wisely advised to start from something small. And being a good student, I started with the. And this may sound strange to you, but actually, linguists are really excited about the. As Jeff Nürnberg, a famous American linguist and a commentator, often remarked. So much so that, as Monica said, one of the more peculiar events in my career happened actually in 2005 when I was summoned to Cambridge to talk to the Queen. Actually, I wasn't in Cambridge there. That was way after I finished my PhD. I was already in my third job here in York. But my old department, the Research Center for English Linguistics, thought that there can't be a more riveting topic you can possibly tell the monarch about than the. Her Majesty was gracious about it. But really, why the? Well, the is the most frequent word in the English language. In fact, articles, and that's the together, account for almost 10% of all spoken and written words in English. So obviously, they do some heavy lifting in English, and they exist in other languages like German or French. But here's an interesting fact for you. The majority of the world languages do not have words for the and a. My first language, Serbian, doesn't have them, doesn't miss them one bit. But what it means is that when people like me come to learn English, they find mastering English articles really difficult. Now, if that was all about then, you'd be entitled to say, who cares? But actually, because articles occur in almost every sentence in English, and because they cause difficulties, they're an incredibly useful structure on which to study one of the central questions of second language research, and that's why a second language grammar is difficult to learn. If you've ever learned a foreign language, you probably ask yourself this question. So explore this question by doing research with people, and with people from different first languages and different levels of proficiency in English. And I look at how they use articles in different contexts and on different tasks, and across many different tasks, from basic pen and paper grammar tests, to describing an unfolding event, to solving a problem with a conversational partner, I got to confirm the basic observation. Yes, people like me from languages that do not have articles find the more tricky than fortunate people who have this grammatical category in their first language. In other words, we make more errors. So sometimes we swap articles, more often we just drop them. And people like me get better eventually, but even after years of learning and on daily use, there will be some errors, some signature patterns. And you can probably detect it in my speech, even though I've spent more than half of my life now in this country. So you may think, well, these people are confused. They really don't understand what the and mean, what they do. And that's what it seems if you look at their speech and writing. But when I designed an experiment that looked at how they process articles in real time when they encounter them in other people's speech, that showed us something different. So in this study, I worked with two lovely colleagues in psychology, and we used an eye tracking machine where our participants looked at pictures and listened to sentences about them, and we recorded the eye movements. Now, eye movements are linked to attention, and attention is involved in language processing, and this is why we can use eye movements to tell us something about language. And this experiment, we worked with Chinese learners of English because Chinese is one of those languages that doesn't have articles, and its speakers find it difficult. So what the participants in our experiments saw, this is how it started, they would see one of these pictures. So a picture in one of these two conditions. As you can see, the conditions are very similar. And the only difference is that in this one, there are two identical objects that are opened, two open cans. And in this one, only one can is open. And after a few seconds, they'd hear a sentence, the pirate will put the cube inside the can or inside a can. And all they needed to do is to look, listen, and click on the location where the object would end up. The task itself is fairly trivial. But eye movements tell us something interesting. So in this condition, when it's clear which object is being referred to, because there's only one can, and you would expect to hear the can, when the sentence mentioned a can, the participants will slow down in launching their looks to the target. And that shows that they were really sensitive to really fine grammatical incongruence. It tripped them. A few hundred milliseconds only, but reliably so, just as it did native English speakers, who we also tested as a baseline. And in this condition, when there are two options, they will slow down when they heard the can. And this is, oops, sorry, I went the other way, when they heard the can, because now the can is the incongruous one because there are two cans and you don't know which one. So rather than being confused, they were actually very sensitive to the meanings that articles signal. And then you kind of think, well, why can't they get them right in their own speech? And I think that really tells us something about why grammars are difficult to learn. So it seems that what you can fairly easily do in a second language, you can map the new grammatical structure, like the cat, to the idea that it represents. So it should be, well, some cat that I should be able to identify in the current discourse. What's really difficult is when you need to express this yourself. And part of the reason why it's difficult is because two languages in a bilingual are always active and they compete for selection, even when a single language is being used. You've probably experienced that if you ever learned a foreign language, you want to say something in one language, but another word barges in. And it's not just words. Grammars compete too. And what this means is that for me or for a Chinese-English bilingual, this idea of a cat that my hearer should be able to identify links correctly to the grammatical representation in English, the cat, but also because of the grammatical option that our first language offers. Say, well, you can express this concept of a cat that somebody should be identified with just saying cat. And this link can be much stronger. Now, you can tell us, and we know that this is not a legitimate option in English. It doesn't help our first language wishing to offer it as a solution, and we sometimes give in. So what's really difficult about second language grammar learning is not necessarily learning this link, but adjusting the weights between, well, suppressing the link with the first language grammatical option and increasing the strength of the link with the new one. And the strength, like physical strength, it's not something you can teach or learn. You just have to develop it through practice. So what I'm saying here is learning grammar may not be difficult, but mastering it probably is, and your first language can be something that comes in the way. So practical implication of this is if you want to master a new language or a grammar of a new language, you need to practice. And the advice that I can give, find something you enjoy doing. If you like singing, well, go to a karaoke bar with friends, or maybe play video games, or watch films, or if you like making model boats, do that, but maybe you can find a fellow enthusiast or fellow enthusiasts who speak the language that you're trying to learn to do it with. Whatever keeps you going. But the important thing is that you need a lot of experience with the language in contexts that are meaningful to you. How much practice do you need? Well, it depends what you want to do. If you just want to order a meal on holiday, probably not that much. But if you want to study in that language, probably a lot more. And that brings me to this second strand of my research, which is to do with language and literacy in higher education. I got preoccupied with this topic when I first arrived to do my master's in this country. And this was when I got a first-hand experience of just how difficult it could be to pursue higher education in language in which you were not brought up from an early age. I did reasonably well, but it somehow felt that I have to work twice as hard and twice as much to perform at a level that I was used to in my first language. So I was thinking, well, how much better does my English need to be to allow me to perform with a similar ease as in my first language? Now, this question, apart from being personally meaningful to me, is important because there are millions of students across the world pursuing higher education in their non-dominant language. First of all, international students. There are over 500,000 studying in this country alone, accounting for 17% of all undergraduate and as much as 66% of all master's students. And if you add to that students coming from refugee or recent immigrant backgrounds, and also students from more established ethnic minority communities, then the number of students who may be UK domiciled but speak English as a language additional to the one they speak at home is then even higher. Now, these groups are hugely important to British universities academically, culturally, and also financially. International student fees keep the UK higher education sector afloat. And they're also estimated to boost the UK economy as a whole to the tune of £28 billion annually. But when it comes to academic outcomes for these groups, the story is less good. So some international students rank among the top performers, but on average, they perform less well than home students. And within the home students population, those coming from ethnic minority backgrounds as an aggregate category don't enjoy the same level of academic success as other home students. And we know that because the Higher Education Statistics Agency collects and reports data every year. Now, the reasons behind these achievement gaps are undoubtedly complex. But because language is one salient dimension on which these populations differ, and because I'm a linguist, my program of research investigates how language and literacy skills affect academic outcomes in university students. So I do this research with some wonderful collaborators and brilliant PhD students, some of whom are here, and some of whom are watching live stream. But the study I want to tell you a bit more about is the one that set off this program of research and was done with Misha Warmington, also here tonight. So in this study, we recruited two groups of university students. British students who spoke English as their first and dominant language, and Chinese students who spoke it as their foreign language. Now, Chinese students are by far the largest subpopulation of international students at UK universities. So we wanted to understand how different their language and literacy skills are, how that changes across the year, and ultimately how individual differences in these abilities at the beginning affect their grades. So we gave them a range of tests at the beginning and at the end of the academic year. So we first tested their fluid intelligence using non-verbal reasoning tasks like this one, where you have to say which of these would best complement this picture. And we found no difference. And I repeated this. In fact, actually, Chinese students were slightly better. And I repeated it in many other studies, which suggest that Chinese students at UK universities are no less bright than home students, and in some cases might be just a tiny bit brighter. But when it came to language and literacy skills, we found very large gaps. We were not surprised to find differences, but we were surprised by how large those differences were. So I'll just give you a snippet of what we found. So for example, we found that Chinese students, and this is the blue box here, had English vocabulary, average English vocabulary, just half the size that of the home students. And more worryingly, it took them much longer to access that knowledge. So there's both knowledge and speed of processing. And we found this double disadvantage on many other tasks. They read at half the speed, and they understood considerably less of what they'd read. They were slower writers and could cover less of the points from the text that they had read. In other words, they were at a striking disadvantage concerning the language skills that are essential for doing well at university. And just to put it in context, the difficulties with reading and writing were far greater than those reported on the same tests for home students with dyslexia, right? Now you can say, well, that was at the beginning. These students will learn, they will improve with practice. I said practice is important, so within a year it will be fine. But we did test both groups at the end of the year, and the gap had not narrowed. The gap at the beginning was so large that despite the improvement of both groups, where the Chinese group finished at the end of the year was far behind where home students were at the beginning. And most importantly, for Chinese students in our study, English skills on entry was strongly correlated with their academic grades. Linguistic skills accounted for half the variance in their academic grades after partialing out statistically the differences in intelligence. That's big. So those who arrived with better skills, better English skills, did better academically. We didn't see such a correlation with home student skills, even though they also had a range of abilities. And the way to think about it, I think, is imagine you have 10 students who have a similar capacity to learn, and therefore a similar capacity to get a similar grade, say mid to 1. And this is this line here. But that they have different language and literacy skills mapped on this blue line. Now, if your language and literacy skills on the lower end, that is below the grade line, it means that your language and literacy skills will be a barrier to achieving the grade that you are capable otherwise of achieving. There'll be a linear relationship between your language and literacy skills and the grades you get. And this is what we got in our Chinese group. To perform at the level of your ability, you need to be on this side of the scale because, then there will not be a barrier anymore, and there will not be a correlation between the two anymore, which is what we found with our home students. Now, you may rightly ask, well, what is this threshold? Can we define it? Can we measure it? Of course we can. There are many tests, English language proficiency tests, designed for exactly this purpose. And one of them that mostly used in British universities is called IELTS, and it uses a scale from 1 to 9. And what they say in their recommendations to institutions is that for linguistically demanding programs, which is most programs, you need a band, a score of 7.5 or above. Now, in our study, the participants self-reported scores between 6.5 and 7.5. This is not unusual. This was actually a very good level by the sector standards because the most commonly asked for cut scores are between 6 and 7. And students with even lower level of proficiency find their way into universities through pre-sessional and pathway programs. And what this means, basically, is that many international students pursue university education at a systematic disadvantage. How much does it matter? Well, I've plotted the self-reported IELTS scores of our participants with the average grade, that they've got. And you can see here that a participant that arrives with the recommended score of 7.5 performs, on average, a whole degree classification better than a similarly able student arriving with 6.5. And 6.5 is by far the most commonly asked for cut score for unconditional entry. So what this study basically shows is that the very large attainment gaps that we see between international and home students that are reported are probably to a very large extent presupposed on the differences in language literacy skills. Now, language skill can be a barrier for home students too. And when we, with my colleague Selma Babaigit, we extended this research to home students who speak English as an additional language, language and literacy skills started becoming predictive again, which suggests that their language and literacy skill can be a barrier, especially for this population. And this is then probably also implicated in the other big attainment gap, that between students with, Black and ethnic minority students, who will be many of whom having English as an additional language. But the good news here is that the language and literacy gaps between these groups were much smaller than what I've showed you for Chinese students, so it's probably easier to close. And in fact, when we started looking at more international students' population, we realized that language literacy skills are not the same. They don't experience the same magnitude of the barrier as Chinese students. So when my PhD student Ivana looked at vocabulary scores for a mixed group of international students who speak English as a foreign language, and this is this orange bar here, the gap relative to home students or other international students who speak English as their first language, the gap was much smaller than that between these two groups and Chinese students. And we think it's something to do with linguistic distance between Chinese and English, and this is something I touched upon earlier. And in fact, when we looked with Justina at European students, and they speak languages that are linguistically closest to English, we found not only that the gap was smaller, but that on some structural linguistic measures like phonology and grammar, European students performed indistinguishably from home students from the start. And on other measures, like reading comprehension, the gap was not only smaller, but they made slightly larger gains and closed it by the start of the second year. So what this is telling you is international students, like home students, are diverse communities. And they face different levels of linguistic challenge, and linguistic challenge can be a big obstacle for academic success. This is not to say that these students can't do well. On the contrary, it shows that many are capable of doing much better than their language abilities allow them to. And that means that universities need to do better in recognizing the challenges that these students face and putting policy in place that would support their additional needs. Now, I arrived in this country as an international student. Was it hard for me? Yes. Would I do it again? You bet. Because I think by the fact that I'm standing on this side of the room today, I've done well out of it. But would I have done it with an immense help and support along the way? No way. So I was lucky to have been mentored and supervised by some of the most brilliant and inspiring people in my field and beyond. And I learned a great deal from my PhD students and collaborators. Of course, I'm grateful to the University of York for taking me on 18 years ago, welcoming me here and supporting my career and development ever since. Working in the Department of Education proved a special boon because not only I have wonderful colleagues, but because when I work along psychologists, sociologists, historian, scientists, I really had to think what it is that my research as a linguist contributes to the bigger picture. Some of the best ideas and insights that I've got in my science came through conversations with my husband, Joe. And he was the one to first point out to me that there's much to language learning than language. And if I really wanted to address the cognitive part of it, I need to work with people who know more about it than I do. And this is why there is a long list of psychologists in my list of collaborators. But of course, for the good early start in life, I have my family to thank. And my brother, who is here today, I don't know whether I was fortunate or unfortunate, you take the pick. He was a very precocious and multi-talented child. And he set the bar high. That was annoying at times, but most of the times it just meant that he cleared the path for me to be supported and to thrive. And our parents were wonderfully supportive of us, but they were also smart enough to realize that to steer me away from the areas of excellence of his, and I have them to thank that I'm a good linguist and not a failed physicist. But really, why are second languages difficult to learn later in life? Well, as somebody before me said, it's complicated. I can't possibly give you a complete answer today. But I hope you leave this talk with 2 take-home messages. And the first one is that bilingualism matters. And the second, you can't do it alone. Thank you.
Danijela, that was wonderful. I love the way that both of our inaugural lecturers paid tribute to all of those who supported them within their family through their careers, and I think it shows that what we achieve as individuals has an awful lot of people behind it. So again, we have a few moments for questions. The microphones will appear as if by magic.
Nadia and Iris this time.
Yeah, thank you very much indeed. So who will kick off? Thank you, Monica in the front row.
Thank you very much, Danijela. That was really, really interesting and a really excellent talk. I enjoyed it very much. I'm wondering about this correlation between skills and outcomes, and what I'm particularly wondering about is how much of the difference, the divergence in the outcomes can be ascribed to the actual quality of the work, and how much is possibly due to a bias by the assessor. I've been thinking about this for a long time, that we have unconscious bias training about all sorts of things, but not about non-nativeness. And I think that plays a really, really big part. So I'd like to know what your thoughts are on that.
Thank you, Monica. I think it's a great question. And that's something that clearly I cannot answer. But that also presupposes that the main problems that international students have is in expressing what they know. So basically we see their result and we kind of judge them on that. But what my research also shows is that there are very big gaps in skills that you need to comprehend and for content acquisition, so like reading comprehension, for example. So, yeah, I can see, I mean, clearly we do have some measures in place like anonymous assignments and anonymous writing. There's moderation, there's double marking, there's kind of many. I was the chair of the board of examiners, so I can tell you a lot about that, kind of all of the practices we put in place for that. But clearly, a bias could creep in. But what I hear, and what I've experienced personally as well in marking, quite often you actually give the benefit of the doubt when you don't understand everything. So actually, it can go either way. It could be that the bias is negative, or it could be that the bias is actually positive.
Thank you very much. Towards the back, please. Stephen.
Do you think, because it seemed logical from your research, that IELTS entry standards should be raised for UK universities, for international students?
I did feel that I might get some advice from you from this conversation.
It's a difficult one because clearly this is not simply a question of, well, there are kind of complex issues behind that. There are pragmatic issues as well. But what I certainly think is that students, applicants, should be made aware of the fact that the cut score that they're being asked to meet is not the same as the score they would need to perform at the level of their ability. And I think that's important ethically because for some students it may not be important, but for students who want to be competitive, who were top performers in their first language and want to be competitive here, this may come as a very unwelcome surprise when they arrive. So in the interest of protecting them, I think it's really important to have this. And then you can make an informed decision. But I also think that sometimes by lowering the entry requirements, we're basically underestimating just how much students would be willing. They take their offers in good faith. They think, well, if that's the cut score, that's good enough. But had the cut score been higher, perhaps they would have tried to meet that instead. So yeah, it's a complex question. So I wouldn't say, no, you have to increase the scores, but I think you definitely need to be aware of how it affects your students, and then whether you need to provide even more support than we are providing at the moment to make them thrive, because clearly they're bright students.
That was my follow-up question, in a sense, is if somebody is arriving at 6.5 or 7, and 7.5 is that magical point, what capacity is there for us in the university to ensure, can we do the catch-up with and for those students by providing additional language training?
Well, what my study shows is that language development at that stage is actually very slow. And what we saw over the years is kind of some improvement, and that was with English language support provided. But I think what we could do as universities is more to look into, say, assessment accommodation. So if you have students who process language at half the speed and don't have as many words, then allowing, well, extra time in exams, for example. So in the same that you would allow a home student with processing difficulties extra time, well, for many international students, they would have exactly, they're bright, but their processing speed is lower. So that could be one option.
Very interesting. I'll think about that. Oh my goodness, there's a couple over here. Can we get a microphone? And then we'll come to you in a second.
Hi, thank you, Danijela. As you know, I'm very interested in this work too. I have the luxury of teaching almost entirely Chinese students, and so I don't have to worry in a sense about the direct comparison with home. I'm looking at the comparison of within that group who can succeed and who cannot, and that's where language alone, I don't think, is the only barrier. I think there's an issue about thinking skills, about preparedness for what we have traditionally thought of as master's level work. And I'm beginning to see this when the bit of work I do with undergraduate home students, that they are beginning to get less and less as good as they used to be at thinking skills. So I think there is an interesting convergence on what good academic readiness is. And I think as linguists, we can do some really interesting work on this, but I think we do need to work with the education people too, and the people who really, really control the levers of selection and direction in our institutions, so that we are constructing a learning environment that is fair, but is mindful of the diversity of the learning capacities that they come with and aim to leave with. It's not a question, it's an observation, sorry.
Yeah. Well, thanks, Claire. I think that's a very valid point, kind of cultural differences and differences in educational backgrounds and how they prepare you. But if you remember that graph with IELTS and with academic scores, that was done within a population from the same linguistic background and from the same cultural background and from the same educational background. So whatever is the contribution of these other things, this I don't know. But what I'm showing is that language plays a very, very big role in those differences. What difference, and that's on top of culture and everything else.
Okay, we're running slightly behind, so we'll take one more question and I think we'll have to move on.
Thank you, Danijela. That was great, really interesting. I was really struck by the parallelness of your lines, that the vocabulary gap wasn't narrowing over the course of the first year, even though these are students who are being immersed in English here. But I was wondering whether there might be smaller differences within subject specialist vocabulary and terminology, and whether that might uncover something about the linguistic material that is particularly useful for that particular subject. I wondered if that was something you were able to look at using this approach.
Again, a great question. So that's really important, the subject level vocabulary. But actually what research shows is the best predictor of academic outcomes is actually the lower level vocabulary. It's a bit like, I think of the academic level English as a penthouse at the top of your however many thousand words you have. Now you can build the top house on the 20th floor, or you can build it on the 6th floor, and you'll have very different views from there. So yes, I think this will help you, but actually most words that you need are the more common words, and if you don't have those, you'll have actually more problems understanding in general. And the other related thing to that is kind of work that I've done with Misha as well, but we haven't published that yet, is when we looked at vocabulary learning in different contexts for home and international students, we didn't find the different ways make that much difference, but that home students always learned twice as many words, non-words, as international students. And that's because they were obeying the phonological principles, phonotactic principles of English. So there's more scope for learning for international students, I'm saying, but actually it's more difficult for them to encode and remember those words as well. So that may be a counterpoint.
Thank you very much. It's that time where we hand over to Paul. And Danijela, you know it.
Thank you.
So no, I'm the person keeping you from the food and fizz outside, so I want to be very quick, but we do have some thanks to make for the event this evening. So firstly to Sarah for superb event management, and to Venita for putting together the programme. Thank you, we've had an absolutely fantastic evening. To Monica for introducing Danijela so eloquently. To Charlie for chairing and for being here and supporting on behalf of the university, which we really appreciate. Our fantastic roving mic helpers, Nancy, Iris and Marcia. I'm going to thank the caterers in advance, because we haven't had it yet, but I'm sure it'll be fantastic. To the AV team for, I'm going to call it the simulcast, is that the right word? So we've been appearing on YouTube at the same time. To all of you who've attended this evening, either via YouTube, but especially those friends and family of our new professors. I think that's a real highlight, to have you to be able to share the evening with our wonderful new professors. And finally, and most importantly, to Kathryn and Danijela for absolutely outstanding talks this evening, and for everything that they've done.
Oh, wow.
So there's two people here for sure who need a drink, and I invite everybody else to join them outside where we have, I believe, some drinks and canapes waiting for you. Thank you.
Don't breathe. Thank you.